Hello and welcome back to the Django DRF and React series. This is part 8, I think. So far we built a simple REST API with Django and a front end with React. We've looked at permissions and view sets and routers very briefly, and then we've applied JSON Web Tokens. We've then headed across and had a look at API schema and documentation. We've looked at filters and search and CRUD in the previous tutorial. So if you're interested in any of those, then please head across to the playlist and have a look at these other tutorials. You should be able to follow this tutorial without these tutorials, but by all means, head it to the start and go from the start, and I'll see you a bit later because there's quite a lot there. So let's head over to this tutorial. So again, welcome to this tutorial. We're going to be uploading images from the front end to our backend RESTful API. We are using React for our front end. So go ahead first of all and build the views and the URLs in Django, and then we'll head over to React and have a look at that. So as we're going through, I'll give you a little bit of detail about some of the different technologies and a little bit about troubleshooting, how you might try to troubleshoot some of the problems that you're bound to occur when trying to apply this to your project. So here we are back in Django. This is the application you can download in the description. So once you've downloaded and you've got your virtual machine running like we've done here, well, first of all, we need to, I'm going to repeat myself, we're going to need to install or pip install Pillow. Because we're going to be utilizing images and manipulating images and so on, Pillow is going to allow us to perform those type of actions. So let's go ahead first of all and install that. So I already had it installed there, you can see, but it doesn't matter. So now that we've got that installed, you can update your requirements file if you want to. If you've not done this before, it's simply a case of freezing and then selecting the file. So that's going to just update our requirements file here. And you can see it's added a few more different packages here other than Pillow. So some other dependencies that it looks like we're going to require. So now that's done, let's just close that. We now need to make a new folder here on the project level. We're going to call this folder media. Now you don't have to call this media. It just seems to be like a de jure way of working, a general standard way of working. So we call this media. This is where we're going to save all the images that we upload and where the images are going to be served from to our front end. So next up, we need to go into the core. So this is the main project folder, settings. And at the top here, I'm going to just import OS. So I'm going to need that to set up. Yep, I'm going to need that to set up the media folder. So at the bottom, we're going to add a few more lines here. So now that we've actually got a media folder, we need to tell Django where this media folder is, so it knows where to save the images. So we can do that by finding two items here, the media root. So we use the OS that we've just imported, get the path, and then join the, essentially here we're getting the path to this directory, this folder directory here, where the actual Django installation is installed here. And then we're using the media folder. So if you wanted to change the media folder to something else, you would need to update this string here and update the media URL. So we're going to use the media URL, the front end, when we request items from our Django backend. We use the media URL to direct the URL to the media folder. Inside of the media folder is obviously where our images are going to be. So that's why we're going to need the media URL so that we can access the images from the web. So now that we've got that in place, we can now go ahead into the blog. Oh, actually, there's one thing that we can do to serve media files locally. If we go into the core URLs, what we can do in here is just define the fact that we're utilizing, at least in this production development environment, we're utilizing the media folder. So sometimes we just need to set that up. So here I'm importing settings, so I can access the media settings we've just defined, and also static, so that I can then go ahead and just run this URL pattern here and just defining the fact I'm utilizing a media folder. So again, that's just going to allow me to work with the media folder locally. Right, so now we've got a media folder. We now want to obviously be able to actually upload images as well as the post information. So if you remember, the blog has the model for the posts. So you can see that we have category, title, etc. that we've been doing in the previous tutorials. But now we want to also add an image to this. So we can do it right here. Now what we're going to do is first of all define the fact that we want to have an image field. So we can do that. I'm going to call mine image model, and then I'm going to use the image field. Excuse me, I'm trying to zoom in. And you can see what I'm doing here is I'm using an underscore. So this essentially here is just a recognition of what this field is, a description of this field, which could be translated into different languages. So what I can do here, and what can be considered as good practice, anytime there's any text that could be translated into other languages, we can just define it in that way. So we utilize the Django utilities translation, and we import the get text lazy, and then we define it as this underscore here. So we're assigning get text lazy. It's the same as putting this here, for example, except for we're just assigning it an underscore to make it easier to utilize less code. So that's why we've got that there. And you can see we've used to upload to, and then we defined a new function, or we're going to define a new function called upload to in a second. And then in addition to that, so that we can easily add this to our existing model, I've added or included the default. So this is going to be the default image. So if someone doesn't upload an image for their post, it's just going to use the default image. So obviously you need to make sure that in your media folder, there is a file called default in the post folder. Okay, so what is this upload to? So we want to specify where we want to upload our files. So what we can do is we can actually create a function. I'll create a simple one up the top here, where we can actually upload or define where we want to upload. So here we have upload to, the function I'm calling. I'm taking in the instance. So the instance that I'm building. So I'm building a post, I then press submit, and then that's the instance, that information. And then the file name. So I've taken those two parameters there, and you can see that I'm just returning the fact that I want to save this image to the post folder and then utilize the file name. Now, a common mistake here is to think that you can utilize the post ID. So unfortunately, you can't use the post ID in this instance here because this is being performed before the data is actually saved. So if you want to use the ID, you'll need to perform an action after the post has been saved and then potentially rename the file that's already been uploaded. So that's a tutorial in itself almost. And I did promise others that I would create a tutorial focused on imaging, managing images in Django. So we'll definitely do that in the future, but here's just something simple so you can get started changing or defining where you're going to save your images. So now you can go ahead and migrate. So I'll go and do that. So make migrations. Now, here we've got a problem. So you can see here we've got a nullable field excerpt. Now, this is just a mistake that's been made. So if this happens on yours, you just need to either remove it or just change this to true. So with that done, we can now just make the migrations and then migrate. Obviously, you could go for a dry run first if you wanted to. And there we go. So now we apply that. So we now have this field ready and available in this model. So let's now go ahead and go into our blog API. So what we can do is add this to our serializer. So after title, we now have image. So we'll just add that to our serializer. So we're going to utilize pretty much the serializer every time we upload new information. So we've added that into the serializer. I just want to double check actually I've done that right. I've called it image. Yep. So it's definitely called image. That's all we need to do there. So let me just close down. So now we can go into the views. So the views at the moment, we've got display posts, just some generic displayed posts. We've got the post search at the moment. And we've also got some admin still, which, as you'll probably agree, if you're familiar with doing development in Django, this is not the most effective, as I've already explained before, but I've done it for a purpose so that we can refactor it later and talk about different methods of slimming down and refactoring code. So now what we want to do is utilize this create post to actually also insert an image. So we want to upload an image. That's what we're trying to do. So I'm just going to toggle that out for now. And I'm going to just build a different class for this. So let's build a new class. I'm going to utilize the API view in this case. So the API view is pretty much the same as using a regular view class. It allows handlers such as get and post. So we'll just do some overriding of this just to show you a different way of creating a more manual, more precise, potentially provide us a little bit more options when dealing with data and so on than what you've seen here, which can be a little bit abstract. So let's go ahead and first of all, we're going to create our permissions. So we can utilize permissions as per normal. So remember, we are using JWT in this scenario now. We covered that in a couple of sessions. We covered that a couple of sessions ago. So we add that in. And now we're going to be utilizing this parser class, multi-part parser and the form parser. So I'll explain that shortly. Let's just go ahead and complete this view first, and we'll move back to that and what that does. But essentially what's happening here is because we want to upload images and text, for example, there's multi-part data. There's multiple types of data that's being uploaded, and we need to be able to handle that. So that's essentially what's happening there. But like I said, we'll swing back to that in a second. So now we're going to create a function called post. So what we're going to do is handle what happens when we actually post a new items. Now, I'm not entirely sure why I've called it user avatar upload. I think I was using this piece of code for another tutorial. So let's just call this post upload or admin post upload. Okay, so next up then, so just to finish off this function here. So as per normal, we're using self to take in or give us the ability to access other variables, etc. outside of the function. We've got request. So this is the user request. So we take in the request. Remember, the user makes a request from the front end. So we take that in. And we also have format none. So here we're basically taking advantage of the fact that our responses are no longer hardwired to a single content type. Remember, we're using multi-content here, images and text. So here we place format none. So it's a little bit of a curveball because it's worth reading about format none. What I've just said there, really what it's used for, you could argue that we're not actually using it, but I just want to introduce it there for you to have a little bit of a research. Okay, so this essentially means that our API will be able to handle URLs such as 123.com/5.json. So if you have a look at the REST framework, it's worth seeing that type of thing to utilize different formats in our URLs. So let's go ahead now and fill this in. So we've got print. So I wanted to explain, and we'll see this much later on, why we've got print here. Now, there's bound to be problems and issues here. And one of the biggest issues that you'll probably come across when you're using APIs is that you get a bad request, a 400. So normally why that is because the data you're sending across is not in the right format for your serializer. So if you want to capture the information that you've sent across just before you hit the serializer, and obviously it will cause issues because the data you've sent across, if it isn't correct and doesn't match the serializer, it won't work. We just capture that before we get to the serializer. And that's going to give us some diagnostic data that's going to help us understand why it is we have a problem, particularly, like I said, when we get the 400 bad request. So next off, we serialize our data as per normal, and we get the data from the request. So we take the request in. Inside of the request is data, and you can see here we've extended here, and we've actually then requested that data, and we put it in this data variable here, and then we sent it across to the serializer. So why I'm showing this example is because now you can see that we can perform different actions based upon whether serializer is valid and so on. And if the serializer is valid, we can perform other tasks. Whereas here in the generic classes here, everything is in the background, everything is abstract. Yes, we can extend, etc. But just wanted to show you an example here of doing this in a different way. So if our serializer is valid, so if our data that we sent across is valid to the serializer, and it will be capable of actually inserting into the database, then we're going to save the data and then just return a response. So this is a handy tool to include because we haven't really spoken about this or started to implement this in our project yet, actually sending messages from the back end to the front end in terms of error messages. So we've done a little bit of handling messages or error messages on the front end only, but not front to back. And I think that is worthy of its own tutorial. And we'll definitely look at that in a later tutorial in this series. So here we can return a response, for example, if we don't have a problem. So this is in the if. Now, of course, if our data isn't valid, we're then going to do the else and return back a response of 400 bad request. So how we generate that is through status. So we can actually now just import this into the project. So as you might imagine, up the top, we're just going to import status in so we can kind of grab and utilize those or formulate those response codes to the front end. So that's status. And then in addition to that, because we're utilizing multi-part parser and the form parser from the framework parsers, we're using both of them here. We just need to import that in too, and that should make up that right there. So now we're kind of good to go there. So let's talk a little bit about this multi-part parser and form parser and what it's really doing for us. So what's important to read through in the Django Rest framework is if you go to the API guide and then search for parsers, and here one of them is specifically the file upload parser. So there is a parser that's dedicated to file uploading, and it's going to look like, I think it's called file upload parser. So we could just use that, for example, if we were uploading a file, but of course we're not just doing that. We're sending across form data. That's what's going to be parsed here. So we're going to send across form data. And in addition to that, we're also going to send across our data that includes the image. So we're going to need multi-part upload support. So by that, I mean that we're going to send multiple different types of data. So image data and text data. So we want to be able to, in our request, break that data up. So we're sending multi-part uploads. And this is essentially for web-based uploads. And we've been told in the manual in the Django Rest framework that we need to utilize multi-part parser. So that's why we've got multi-part parser and also the form parser. As it says in the manual also, typically you want to use the form parser and multi-parser together in order to fully support HTML form data. Okay, so let's now, I think we're finished off. I think we're finished here in actual fact. I think this is all that we need to do here. So this is essentially going to, just to recap, handle the uploading of our new data, particularly because we're going to be sending across both form data, which includes text and an image. So that's going to handle that right there. And you can see that if it meets our serializer guidelines, so this is obviously connected to the serializer fields are connected to our model. Our model defines what we can actually include in that particular field. That's how it's all connected there. So as long as it matches or meets the serializer criteria, our data, we're obviously going to save that data and send a response back. So now we can head across to the URLs because we're going to need to set up a new URL for this. So originally we had this path admin create. So I guess we'll just use that again. So we'll just change that around. So now it's called, or in actual fact, we might as well just use the old name, haven't we? So let's just change that to create post, and let's just make sure that that's connected. So we've got create post up here, and we're importing it in. So that looks like all that we need to do to get that working. So that's all now connected up nicely. Okay, right. Let's just go into the settings of our core, we're just going to turn off. I know that I do this fairly regularly, and we don't need to do this, but I'm just going to turn that off just to make it easier for us to test this before we do anything else. And then I'm going to open up what is Postman. So this is something that I introduced a couple of tutorials ago. So this is a piece of software called Postman. This is just one way of you actually testing out your API. This can be a little bit more graphical based. You can see that we can save items. We can use curl, for example, but again, this is a little bit more graphical based. We can save items and so on. You can see here I've got tabs up the top here for different requests. I might want to send my API to test it. So this one here has been set up to send. Let me just set this up for you. So we've got the post. I've selected body and form data. Then I've selected file in one of these keys here. And then that's allowed me then to upload or select a file. Okay, so you can see also I've added all the other fields that I'm going to need. I just added some dummy data there. And once I've got that in, I'm just going to point it to my API. Now I have turned authentication off. So the reason I did that, so I don't have to also play around with web tokens here. I could obviously do that very easily in Postman. I could save my web tokens in a variable, and then I could run this, etc. But it just prevents me having to do that, and it takes literally a couple of seconds to turn off JWT. So let's just send and see what we got. So at the moment, we couldn't get a response because our server's not actually turned on. So let's just let's just go ahead and do that. I think I've made a mistake there. Okay, so let's just go ahead and run the server. So now we send it again. There we go. So if you do get a response like this, it's because there's a problem. So if you just get something like that, that's not what we're expecting back. So there's just got to be a problem here. So if you look at the URL, it doesn't look like potentially I'm focusing on the right place. So let me go back to the URL. So what I should be looking at is admin and create. So again, I need to change that, press send. There we go. So it says authentication credentials were not provided, which is interesting. So if you remember, if you go back to your views, we do have authentication set up. So I'm not actually logged in. So I'll just remove that quickly so we can test this out. So I'll try this again, and there we go. So we sent off some fake details. You can see we've updated this image here. Now it says here that we're using media post default, which is interesting because remember that's the default image that we're utilizing here in our model. So that tells me that this image isn't uploading properly. Now you can see that everything else seems to be okay. So let's just move that back down again. So you can see that this is called avatar, whereas if I go into the serializers, we're looking for image. So this is why it's not working. So again, this is just because I was using it for a different project. So, but it just gives you an idea of some of the problems that you're going to have. So now I've called it image. Again, make sure that there's a drop down here, file, make sure it's called file, then you can upload an image. So I press send again. And now what I get is a message, this field is not unique. So the reason it's not unique is because one of these items here has to be unique, and that's the slug. So we carry on and we do this, add some more text to the slug here to make it unique. So I press send again, and there we go. So now what you see in this list, just about on your screen maybe, is you've got ID, title, and you can actually then see the image that we've uploaded. And it tells you also where we put it. So let's go back into our project now, go to media, go to our posts, and you can see we've got an image here called asd.png. And there we go, that's the image that we've just uploaded. So that just tests to make sure that it's working. So I am focusing on this troubleshooting because you will have many problems, no doubt, trying to do this. There's a mixed message online, looking through some of the materials, etc., to see what people have already done, try and make something a little bit different for you. But I ended up just trying to solidify what is out there, and I'm going to try to give you some feedback in what you might see if you're trying to perform this and looking at different materials. So what you'll notice that when we've uploaded file, you can see in the console now this data, this query here, this query dictionary. So you can see that the image is uploaded as an in-memory upload file. So what this is telling you quite clearly is this endpoint works. Okay, as long as we're using, in this case, let's have a look at our body. As long as we're utilizing the correct data and we're uploading the file, and it should be a file, and we're using form data, this data is inside of form data, which we'll talk about in a minute when we get to the front end, then this should work. So try and utilize this as a guide. If I go into the code, you can, in this program, if you're utilizing, for example, Node, you could click on Node and it gives you the code now to actually run this query, or sorry, to run this request. And you can just copy and paste this into your program. Same with PHP and so on. So I just wanted to quickly show you that if you're utilizing this for different programming languages, it doesn't have, it has JavaScript fetch, which we could use in actual fact, and then just change it to Axios. I suppose we could use it for that potentially. So it does have code that we can utilize, which is handy. But if you go into, for example, the headers, we can see what we're sending across. So you can see the server, the content type. Now notice the content type says application JSON, which is fairly interesting, potentially here that we're sending across. And there was something else I wanted to show. And I thought it was in code, but it's not. Okay, no problem. So you can see that it's working okay. So let's now move across and go to the front end and then apply all this to the front end so that we can upload images and then display the images in our React application. Okay, so before we actually do that, let's just put back our permissions and then go into the settings, and we just add our JWT back. So we've got our authentication back in place, and go ahead and download, if you like, the React application that we're going to build from. It's in the description, a link in the description, and I'll see you over in the React application. So just to quickly recap what we've done so far, you can see that we're building this really simple blog facility. These posts are being generated from our Django backend. We're inside of React now, if you're wondering where we are. Sorry, I'm talking very quickly. So there aren't any images. I've taken those out now, and we're going to actually generate those images for the post through uploading it first to the Django backend, and then we're going to use our API to collect those images as well as all the data that you can see here. So we can click and go into the individual items. So we've done the single page, and we can also search for items utilizing at the moment just individual words that have to match the start of the actual item we're looking for. So we've got Django and I think we've got React. There we go. So we've got two items there in the search. So we've done that. We've got login and log out and register. That's all working using JWT authentication. And in addition to that, in the previous tutorial, we created the admin area where we could create, return, update, and delete items if we wanted to. So that facility is now in place. So now what we want to do is create the facility to create an item, but to also include an image. Okay, so let's do it. Well, that sounded really positive. Okay, let's do it. So let's go into our React application. Let me just size this up a little bit. Okay, right. So let's first of all just deal with setting this up. So I'm just going to close all, and we've already got an existing create file. So all we need to do is overwrite that. So what I recommend you do is just copy and paste that first, and before you start playing around with anything. So I've copied and pasted that. So if I need to go back to it, I won't need to, but just a little strategy to ensure that you don't mess things up, I guess. Well, that sounded really positive. So let's go into our project here. We've got create already, if you remember. So we don't need to make any new files here. All we're going to do is overwrite or change the create item. So let's just remember that Axios is right here in the main project folder area. And you can see that we're just extending from the Access instance to generate a request. And our request at the moment includes our access tokens. If we need to send those across to authenticate, we will do every time we make a request. And you can see that the content type has been set to application JSON, and we accept back from the server application JSON. So that's what we got back here. The code down here is just going to help us to, if you remember from a previous tutorial, it's going to allow us to generate our refresh tokens so that we can stay logged in. So that was the Access file, in case you're wondering about that. And you can see that we've also got our base URI or URL already set out. So we just need to extend from that when we create an instance of, or an Access instance from this. Okay, so the first thing I guess is to add a new item in our grid, in our existing grid. So head down to around about line 190. You can see that after the last grid item, which is the item or the input field where we enter the content, we're now going to put a new input field. Now, this isn't like we've kind of moved away here from Material UI just for this example. But you can see we've got this input here, which accepts an image, and I defined what type of image, maybe any type of image. We've got some classes if we want to add it up, hook it up to some CSS. We've got an ID here. So icon, button, photo, for example, something like that. So let's just call this post image. There we go. So let's just call this post image. And we've got the on change. So we're going to perform an action when we change. In this case, it's going to perform an action when we upload a file. And it's basically just going to be stored in state. You can see it says name, image, and file type is going to be file. Whereas normally we don't define those on the inputs. So we're defining it's going to be a file. So there we go. And then we've got this little label here. If you want to use a label, I'm just going to get rid of the label. Not going to need that for now. Okay, so that's pretty much all we're going to need there. I'm not too sure what that is. So I'll get rid of that as well. Okay, so now we've got our input field. Let's have a look to see what that looks like. So if I go to new post, we've got this button here. You can see it's not been styled. I may style it before I upload it, but it's functional. That's all I want to show at this point. So I can choose a file, and that should allow me now to choose a file. So let's go back. So what we want to do now is handle that. So when we submit this image, we're now going to utilize the handle change. So handle change is basically taking the data that we're typing in the text fields, for example, and it's just uploading or saving it to the state. So we just need to change the handle change function to include also the image. So we've given it a name of image so that when we want to manage this data in the handle change, we can identify the data from the name and do something different. So that's important to remember. So back up here then in the line 70 here, we've got handle change. So you can see what's happening here is that every time I type in something into an input field, this handle change is going to be utilized. So you can see that if, for example, the target name, so remember the target name, so every input field has a name, and if a name equals title, so if I'm dealing or typing in something into the title input, this is going to be run. So you can see I'm updating the state. So I've got two states here, which I'll explain in a second, one for the image and one for text. So this is going to update the text state. And you can see I'm taking the target name, and then basically I'm just going to trim that and for any white space, etc., and then put it into the state up here. So I do that. Now, at the same time, if you remember from the previous tutorial, I'm also updating the slug. So the slug is going to be slugified utilizing this code here. And there's a link to this piece of code. It's basically just going to slugify the text. So we've got that in place, and then we've got an else here, which is also then going to just upload any other text we type into the other input fields and put it into the state. And of course, what we're trying to record here is the title, slug, excerpt, and content. So let's go ahead and add a new item here. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically target the image this time. So if the name equals image, so if we upload something to the image field or use the upload input for the image, then this is going to be run. So what we're doing here is we're taking the files. So whereas before we're utilizing value, on images we're utilizing files. I guess that's the important thing to focus on here. Now some people will also utilize, for example, 0 here to represent what file we're uploading. That isn't going to work in this instance, but if we were uploading multiple files or trying to return multiple files, that's how we could reference that if we were using an array. So we're not using an array this time, we're just we're just going to set up a basic state for this here, which is set to null. So this is where we're going to post that image inside of here. So we utilize set post image to actually set the data, and then we're going to utilize post image to get the image data later. So we've got this console log. Now that's obviously optional whether you want to just output that just to check to see what you're actually storing, but I'm not going to need that right here. So I'll just remove that, and I'll leave that so we can see it, in a second. So you can see I've updated the image there. Otherwise, I'm just updating the state here with any other text. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, just let me know and I'll explain it in the comments. So now we're saving the data. If you're wondering where all this other code comes from, if you've not seen the other tutorials, we've been generating this for the past 7 tutorials. So if you are interested, head back to the start and go through. So now we need to manage this data. So what's pretty good to do, maybe if you're not familiar with utilizing Axios or sending data across, is to not try and tackle, again, only if you're not familiar with or you're new to this type of development, try and do something individual first and then integrate it in. So for example, here we have the code which is going to explicitly send off via Axios the data that we've inserted into the form. So up here I've got the code which is a little bit more slimmed down. So if you remember what's happening in this project, for example here we're going to import Axios instance from the Axios file, and we're just going to extend from it. So we use the Axios instance that's been detailed in the Axios page to then send off or do something. But here what we're going to do, what I was trying to get to, was the fact that let's just start off explicitly, and then we can work towards slimming it down and refactoring. So here what's going to happen here is we're actually just going to use Axios itself, and we're going to set up all the parameters. So let's just make sure that we've got it installed or available, and we do up here. So let's just go down. Okay. So what we're going to do, you can see we're going to set up a variable here, which is going to define the headers. So here what we're doing, we're defining multi-part form data. So we're just specifying and telling Django that we're using multi-part data. So that just matches up, if you remember, the data that we set in the Django, in wherever that is, somewhere. We've set that up earlier in Django. So we've defined, for example, we go into the views, we defined we're using multi-part parser and form parser. So we're just kind of matching that up with the header type. So we're just telling Django that's the type of data that we're sending across. And then we set up the URL. Now this URL is wrong. So let's just go ahead and change that. So we changed the URL, if I remember, to admin create. So let's just make sure we got that in place. That's where we need to send it. And now we're setting up our form data. So we're specifying that we're utilizing form data. So think of this as a format of preparing data to be sent across. So what we're doing here is we're just preparing that data inside of our form data here, so that it can be utilized correctly with multi-part form data. And then in addition to that, we also want to make sure that when we return the data, that when the data gets parsed, it gets parsed in that format too. So this is where sometimes it can get tricky to understand why something is going wrong. And this can be one of the most common causes of problems because the data isn't in the right format. So if you remember previously in Axios, for example, or any other file, we're utilizing application JSON. So the program is just expecting JSON format data to be sent across and then handling that data. So here we're using multi-part form data. So we're generating some form data here. So let's just explain that. So of course, go ahead and type in what is form data. Form data provides an interface that easily construct a set key value pairs representing form fields and their values. So it sounds very much like JSON, if you ask me. So you can see how we're going to set this up. Of course, we could just loop through the data here, but this is just explicit for you so you can see what's going on. So we create some new form data, and then we append the form data with this new data, so the title, and then we grab the title from our store. So remember, we've got our store here, which we grabbed through post data. That's how we get to this data. So we go to post data, and title, and then we do the same thing for the slug. Now we are explicitly typing in the author still, because we've yet to do that tutorial where we look at utilizing a persistent state. So we'll do that maybe in the next tutorial. So for now, we just hard coded that in, the author. And then we go ahead and the excerpt, the content, and then we go to the image. So notice here, we get the image via post image. So that's this store here. And, this store here. So this has been saved here in this state. So we grab that item. It's the first item in the state. So we use the 0 and we select the image. Okay, so because we've saved it as image. So let's just remember, if we go a bit further up here, we've selected the image. So when the image is inputted, this will fire off and this is run. And you notice that we put it into the state as image and then the actual file. So that's why we're referencing image here, because that's what we've referenced it when we put it into the state. So that will collect the image. Okay, so now we utilize Axios. So here, like I said, we're not using the instance that we've already built. We're going to create our own Axios instance. So that takes in 3 parameters generally: the URL, the data, and the config. So we've already set out the config here. That's just the headers. We've got the URL, which is going to be the admin create. And then in addition to that, we've also then got the form data. So we take that in and we get a result. So that should be it. Now we need to remember, before I forget, we've just turned on security again, and we're not utilizing that at the moment. So apologies again. I'm just going to turn this off for now. So that's the authentication. And then in the view, I'm just going to remove this for now, just to get it working without authentication. So we head back into the admin and we're going to new post. See if we can type something in. I'm just going to pause and upload something. So I've selected a file and that should be about it. So I press create. So it looks like we may have done something. I was expecting us to be returned, but we've not done the forwarding yet. So, and that looks like it might have been done. So let's go back into the page here. So it looks like we've got a new post. It looks like it's working okay. So that's obviously the first check that we need to do. So let's go back into our admin area and go to posts. So we've got a post here. We've got an image. Looks like the right image. So let's just try this out one more time. Let's just delete that. So let's just try this one more time. Apologies, I keep pausing to upload an image because I just don't want you to see everything that's on my desktop. And then, so I've chosen a file, selected the file as per normal, press create. Now just this so I can recognize it. So that's that. So let's go back. So we've got something here. You can see it is actually working because I've already put the code in for that. So that's all good. So what we can do is just check, first of all, the Django admin. Now, the telltale sign, if we've not done something right in terms of the image, is that we'll be utilizing the default image. So that would tell us whether we've done that correctly or not. Now, something else that we need to look out for is if we go into the Django console, obviously this is going to tell us if there's a mistake. So let's just simulate something here. So let's, for example, change the image. Okay, that Let's just change, for example, this here, and then just try and create a new item, just so that we can see an error. That seems to be a bit bizarre. Not too sure why it's doing that now. So we change the URL. So this shouldn't work, of course. Press create. Now I can see here in the admin, Django admin, it says not found. So it will be providing us some good feedback in terms of what is happening or what isn't happening. So it's good for us to keep this on and just double checking what's going on. Obviously, we can see that it's working, but this will pick up some nice errors for us when you are troubleshooting. So I do have a question for you, which hopefully one person can, or someone can answer for me. So if I were to code this out using classes, traditional React classes, etc., then this would just work okay if I, for example, utilized one state for both the image and the data. Now notice here, you might be asking, why am I using one state here for an image and one state here for the text? Well, the reason why that is because if you're going to be utilizing hooks in React, for some reason, when you move everything over to hooks, functions, if you put the image inside of here, for example, and just utilize one state, what happens is that it just doesn't work. So if you can tell me why that is, please do. Please put it in the comments. I've got a rough idea why that is, but it's a really bizarre problem, and it'd be one that if I get a bit of time, I'll try and fix. But you can see here we're utilizing two states here, one for the actual post data and one for the image. So that was just something else just to let you know about if you are going to try and do this and you are receiving an error because you're utilizing just a single state, utilizing React hooks and functions here. Okay, so you can see that it's working. So we've got this working. You can see this is all manual based. So let's now switch over to our Axios instance. So before we were just using Axios. Now remember that we've already got our Axios instance, so we can just reference that, and it has all these settings already predefined for us. So we don't need to do as much. So let's just go back in. Let's go to the top. Let's just remove Axios. We're now going to be utilizing our Axios instance. And we also need to set up our redirect. So let's go ahead and we're going to just remove all this stuff here. We're not going to need that anymore. Okay. And now we're just going to head over to this here. So let's just back out. So you can see the difference here. I'll add that in so you can have a look at that. I'll just leave this in for now. Apologies. You're going to watch me do this now. If you're wondering why I'm not using shortcodes on my keyboard, it's because I've got this weird keyboard setup. So you can now see that we have a new way of doing this. So we'll put all the data inside our form data as before. Again, you could refactor this down slightly by creating a looping through. Whether you actually create less code, be roughly the same, I think. You can see we've manually put in all the data in, appending the data and the image, and this time we're using the Axios instance. Okay, so this time you see that we are just sending it off to the admin create, and we're just using the data. We're not defining the headers here. So if you remember, the Axios defines all the headers, including our authentication, that we're going to need to authenticate and actually send this data. So what we can do now is go back into Django. Apologize, there's a lot of switching around here all the time. I do apologize, but I'm now back in Django. So I go to my views. I'm just going to put back the authentication or the permission, sorry. That's in the view for our create post. And then if you remember, I need to go to the settings and I just need to put that back. And now we're using JWT. So we can test that by going into Postman and pressing send. And it says here authentication credentials and were not provided, which suggests that authentication is now turned on. So let's go back to our front end and just go to the blog. You can see it's still okay. Looks like we all are authenticating. Now again, we can go down into Django and see if that was the case. We didn't get any message there in actual fact. So let's just refresh. Okay, so that's not a problem. There's a not found here because I don't actually have the default image set up. That's all that's going on there. Okay, so let's go into our admin. So we need to do that manually still at the moment. Let's create a new post. We're going to call this Fs. And we're going to choose a file. So I've chosen a file and then I press create post. So we created the post. You can see all the data that's been created. Looks like it's done what it's meant to do. So let's go back into the home page. There we go. So now we've got authentication applied. JWT is also working, so we've got all that authentication also now in place. And you can see that we're uploading and now we're displaying. So let me just quickly show how to display an image. All we need to do is go across to the page where you want to display the image. Apologies, I'm in Django there. So if you go into the post section, we've got the post. So that is going to actually display the images. So down here, we've got the loop whereby we're looping out all the data that's being returned. Now down here, we've got the card media. Inside the card media, we've got the image. Now, how we collect data is that we take all the data that's been returned from the database, that's inside of this post variable. We then map it across to post. And for every single instance inside of this post array here, we're going to basically loop it out. And now one of the parameters in our data is called slug, image, and so on, post title, and so on. So basically, we're just going to use image and then post title. So what was here originally, if you remember, I was connecting to an API, an online API to get some images. But now I don't need to because we're going to upload our own images. And there we go. And there we have it displayed on the screen. So let's just double check again. If we go down into, apologies, if we go down into our media, you can see that all the images that we have. Now notice that we're uploading the same image. Django is renaming that image. So there's definitely some administration you'd want to do there to maybe rename the image yourself or organize it in a way. I would prefer to organize this in a way so that all the images are in a corresponding folder that relates directly to the post. So what I mean by that is that if I've got post ID 1, I want to make a folder called number 1 so that when I delete the post later on, it's not so much of a headache trying to find all the media that's associated to it. That's what I think we need to think about when we're creating a folder with images for a particular post. We need somewhere in later on to be able to identify that image to that post so that we can clean it up easy. So I just wanted to point this out, that the fact that in our Axios instance, we're using content type application JSON. Now, if I go into the create, we're not actually utilizing, or we've not actually defined the multi-part form data like we did originally. We're just utilizing whatever's in Axios application JSON. So you would imagine potentially this isn't going to work. So let's just see what happens. I'm just going to remove this and explain this in a second. And the reload, so it doesn't redirect. Let's go back into the new post. I'm just going to open up the console. So we capture this. I've gone into the network tab. We're just going to capture this request and have a look at the data. So let's just make a new piece of content, add an image, press create. And if I now go back here, you can see that I've created this request here. So I go into there and you can probably just about see here what's happened, where I've sent it and requested it. Status code, we've got 200. So this has given me some really good information here. Now I've got some response headers, but further down you can see that I've sent across my JWT token. And in addition to that, it says content type, multi-part form data, and also the boundary. So it's actually defined what content type to utilize automatically. So that's pretty much the point I wanted to make. So it seems to be forcing this rather than utilizing the JSON application. content type, it's actually forced and is utilizing multi-part form data. So that's what I wanted to show you. Down the bottom here, you can actually see the data that you're sending. So this is a good resource for you. And in addition to that, we've got this form data. You can see we've got this multi-part form data here, separated by these form boundaries of the different data that we're sending across. So that's what we're actually sending across. So that can be useful for troubleshooting too. So just finally then, you can see that I've also included a history push. So I'm utilizing history. So I've imported history in as per normal, use history from the React router DOM. And then we set this up. So you need to set it up first. So I put it into a history variable here, use history, and then I've utilized it down here. I'm basically just pushing the user to the admin page once they've created a new post. Now I'm also utilizing this small hack here, Windows location reload, because otherwise it won't appear straight away. So I just force a reload for now so that I can actually see that I've created an item. Similar to what I've done in the delete and edit, I've forced the issue of reloading so that it would actually display what we've just completed or the action that we've just taken. Okay, so there we go, a small one, but hopefully a valuable lesson there on how to upload an image, some items to think about, maybe a little bit of reading to do. And then we've uploaded images from our front end to a back end. We've also then displayed the image on the front end. We built some views and URLs to handle that. And we looked at a different way of generating a view. And then we've gone to the React and we just built upon what we've already done in the React application by just expanding or just changing the create component to include the image. And we created a very simple image input field to upload an image, and we sent that across. So all in all, it is a fairly simple process, but one that you can easily get wrong. So I do I do invite you to ask any questions that you might have. Now, if you are having problems, it can be difficult when you just say, yeah, I've got this problem. I mean, it could be a million and one things potentially that could go wrong. So I will try and help as best as possible. But of course, there's other services that you could ultimately utilize to get some help. So for example, Stack Overflow is a good site for you to post your code, and then people, including myself, can go along and have a look at your code and then try and solve your problem. Hopefully I've given you some good diagnostic tools today and some pointers towards that to help you solve some of these issues. Most issues are very solvable by looking at some of the tools and features that I've mentioned today. So definitely have a go before you start posting. These things can take time, a lot of time. So keep at it, and hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.